Or are we ready to go, Matt? Okay. You'll get the regrounding effect. So that it'll be hey, this is where we've been, because I'm sure you remember. Hey. Well, welcome. It's good to be with you. This is the final night for the Why the Mystics Matter book study that we've been doing over the last 4 sessions. So I'm going to start off tonight by grounding us in where we've been so far. So whether you were here or not, you'll have at least enough of a flyby to be dangerous in your knowledge of this text. And then I'll bring us more deeply into the second half of the book and the mystics that are named therein. Christian was very jealous because he got his least favorite mystics, and I got his most favorite. And I told him he could have done an inversion of the book, but he didn't think he could do that. So anyway, welcome. As we begin, let us start with a prayer. O God, who meets us in the everydayness of our life, I pray that you would quiet our souls and spirits enough that we might hear you, that you might lead us into places of safety and goodness, that we might know your love, and that love, as our mystical friends and forebears remind us, might be that which rightly centers us in this life, in the miraculous wonder that is each breath and each moment that we have, that we might then live more truly and deeply the love that is ours in you, and live it in such a way that we know and embody the greatest call and commandment that you have given, which is to love you with all that we are, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. In your name, amen. Well, if you're just joining us in person, hop on in. And if you're just joining us online, hop on in as well. So a quick little overview of where we've been from the prior nights. On night 1, Christian started us off with an introduction into mysticism. And he, in many ways, named what also our author names in the book, and highlights that. And just a sense of, like, in so many ways, actually, to name what a mystic is, or mystical, or mysticism, there's so many different words, or people have used these words, so that's kind of, he himself is saying that even as the author of this. But we can ground it a little bit in seeing that it was first used in 1736, and then Christian also brought us through talking a little bit more about how we can see mysticism as a kind of contemplation connected to even the Greek lineage there. And so broadly, I think mysticism, as Christian was bringing it into it, and us into it in the Christian tradition, is that way of seeking after God, that kind of turning inward, that sense of the mystery of God. Like faith becomes, in so many ways, the mystical union, the mystery of experience, that which is intangible, that we can access, that's beyond just our rational knowing, but it's something of spirit and of heart and of dreams and of union with God. And so he named some of that for us. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just kind of trying to bring us a little bit into it. And the way that this is, I think in so many ways he was trying to help name, this is a long tradition inside of our faith. Even if we haven't necessarily known all of it, it influences the way that we even understand our own faith today. And some of what last week our author named is the pietistic experience, but I think that sense of the heart, the life of faith, something beyond just rational knowing. So Christian then detailed for us 2 major historic moments in mysticism. So you have the monastic experience, and if you think of it, if some of what we read in this text and some of mystical experience is the movement into silence, or the ability to pay attention, to be able to kind of quiet things. If you're in a monastical rhythm in life and you're spending days and hours, or hours and days, I guess it would go that way, in prayer and contemplation, there's a kind of silence you drop into that's not possible in the rhythm of most people's lives. That isn't to say that probably all of us We may have had our own mystical experiences in the midst of washing dishes. But you probably didn't have time. Elgin did not have that experience washing dishes, but others of you may have. But you probably didn't have or take time to write them down, which is another aspect of mystical life that makes that possible. And then there was another movement where we see that deeply connected to some reform in the 1200s to 1600s. So Christian then brought us through some of the reasons we see this inside of the Christian faith, and then some of the ways that also Neoplatonism, and Christian talked about that, so you can go see night 1 if you really want to hear a lot more about that. So he also named that there were social reasons that led to the rise of new mysticism, and some of it being that it was a space for dissent and for social reform. And so he also named this. A thing that we talked about last week as well, which was a question that I had raised, is you see in this text how many of them are women. And that's a beautiful part of this tradition that wasn't true in all of the historic scholastic theologies and other traditions inside of our faith. So there's a real beauty in that. And so then he wrapped us up that first night. Look at that. Wrapped us up that first night in talking about the mystical experience. And often he was naming that there's some threads you see of that there's this kind of process of moving into the interiority of one's life, into the heart of God, that even as it's looked different for different mystics, Christian named some of the ways that you see meditation, prayer, contemplation, opening up mystical awareness for people. But also this sense of like you can't make it happen. Like I don't know if you've ever been somewhere and suddenly just time slows, or you all of a sudden look around and wonder. You're not manufacturing that. Like something just opens up. For me, I think that's God's Spirit opening us to the beauty and the wonder that is around us. But you can't just go into nature and be like, I will have a mystical experience. You know, it doesn't usually work that way. And so he named that as well. And that's that sense that our experience of reality, the perception of it, can be altered, and it can be beyond our understanding or comprehension. So then night 2 was when Christian really brought us more deeply into the work of Therese Lisieux and Meister Eckhart, and then also into Ignatius of Loyola's Examen. And so again, I'm not going to do a significant overview here, but just wanted to highlight that he talked about the chapter that we have here with Teresa and her experience of God's absence, and then moved us to talk about Meister Eckhart and the otherness of God. And then he went into the work of the daily examen and the work of Ignatius of Loyola. And I will just say, as a person who did their PhD at a Jesuit institution, I've really appreciated some of that tradition's way of just opening up prayer and discernment. And it's been a really beautiful addition to my faith. So you may want to check that out. So that was just where we went. Then night 3, we actually had the author with us, which if you were there, you may have noticed that I didn't say his name at the beginning ever, because I was in one of those moments where I was sure I was going to say it wrong. So I just kept being like, our author, the really great author, we're so glad the author is here with us. But it was indeed wonderful to have Frederick Bauerschmidt with us last week, and to be able to hear from him. I'd encourage you, it's on our YouTube page if you weren't able to be here. We got to hear him give a little bit more of an overview of how he came into this work, how his faith has been deeply influenced through the mystics, and really I think he converted to Catholicism in large part due to the work of Thomas Merton. And then we were able to have some ongoing conversation with him as persons who aren't Catholic, but are in a Protestant church, and talking about our own faith and tradition. So if you weren't here for that, I'd encourage you to take a look. So I'm going to pause just for a second. Is there anything coming out of the first 3 nights that is just like a burning question, comment, thing that you want to make sure we vocalize or is heard in this space before we move into the second half of the book and taking a look at those folks? Yes.
This question may have been addressed, but I didn't pick it up. But I was sharing with somebody that, about this book, and they said, and I had a question too, are all mystics Catholic? Okay, that was one question. Who determines that it's a mystic? There's the questions that have come out. Who says now they are a mystic? And is Henry Nouwen considered a modern-day mystic / are there modern-day mystics? These are questions that come up as I've discussed the book with people.
Okay, so I'm going to share my thoughts, and if anyone wants to jump in and share others, you can. One, no, all mystics are people who have been identified or are identified as mystics and who are writers, etc., Christian thinkers, aren't all Catholic. You did see, and I think we touched a little bit on this with him, our author, last week, where in part what you see is this is a major tradition in what is just the one church in the West at the time, which is the Catholic Church. And so much of that is you also see the contemplative life, the being sequestered away, and that long lineage going back to the early church. That's a major thread. And so again, when you have that space for quietude and silence, that became a big part of the tradition and an understood way that people would experience faith. At the time of the Reformation, in many ways, there's many reactions against different aspects of the Catholic faith and traditions. And so some of that would have been repudiated or eschewed because so much of Protestant faith and the Reformation is also rooted in the Enlightenment and in the way that sola scriptura, there's these threads inside of Protestantism that are very intellectual, very life of the mind, which is to say that there still were, and have been mystics. If you even think about Luther's experience of his conversion, I think is very identifiable as a mystical experience. He has a sense of God showing up, and in this deep experience of grace, he has a vision, and that's what ends up making Luther change everything about his life, right? You also see some folks who, like John Wesley, who Methodism comes out of his life work. And he has this, the deep part of Methodism, if any of you were raised there, is my heart was strangely warmed. So it's this experience of the interiority of faith, of mystical union or experience with God. And you see that up until today. So to two of your other kind of questions, the one is, this is my opinion. Some people would, I'll say some people's opinion and then I'll say my opinion. Some people would say, oh, if someone says I'm a mystic, then you should be suspect. I'm kind of like, well, why? If someone says their faith is more mystical and that's the way they experience their faith, if you've had experiences of visions or dreams or the sense of more of, I think, the wonder and then call yourself a mystic. Great. Are we following Jesus? Great. How are you living out your faith? Great. Even in the text, he talks about how, in talking about Julian of Norwich, how some of her encouragement or her teaching to people who would come to her and say, I have visions of God, would be to judge it according to the love of God and love of neighbor. And so it's, so there's still a way of being able to say, hey, is this legit? Is it not? So I had a mystical vision of Jesus. He told me that I could just harm all my neighbors. Probably not a mystical vision of Jesus, sort of thing. So that's a long way to say, there have been Protestants. It's historically a Catholic tradition. There's reasons for that. I think if someone says they are a mystic or that the mystical or the mystery of life deeply impacts them, great. So I, for instance, do not identify as a mystic holistically, but I would say that the mystical lineage of our faith it shows up in my life and pops up. Like my experience of labor was profoundly mystical. I have had experiences where I have felt like deeply held in the love of God in a way that I can't even explain to you. And I know I'm not alone in that. And so that's where I might not be like, I am a mystic, but, and so some modern day folks, a big one that many people in our community have read is Richard Rohr. And I think he's a person who's often identified as a modern mystic. But yeah, kind of people who write in that sort of like divine dance, a little bit like, kind of thing that's generally somewhat mystical. Yeah. I'll give you this. You have a friend.
I'm so lucky to have a friend.
I'm glad you have a friend.
One friend. And she has gone to Medjugorje multiple times and has felt deeply, deeply impacted.
I don't know. Where's Medjugorje?
I don't know.
So is that some place in the
Catholic.
world that's
It's
like known for pilgrimage or being a really
Yes,
sacred
correct.
place?
very,
Okay.
very, very sacred,
Great.
where I think Mary, the mother of Jesus,
Okay.
shows up,
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
Are those then considered mystical places?
Great. So there's so the Celtic faith tradition is a major Protestant faith tradition that it really is, I would say, is deeply mystical. Okay, so the Celtic faith and spirituality. And why I bring that up is because A, I didn't mention it during the Catholic part, but B, because one of the notions very central in the Celtic faith tradition is the idea of thin places. In the sense that there are places in our world where the spiritual realm and earth realm, like our breath, they're in that place together. So for instance, a place in the world that's often thought of this is where Notre Dame is in Paris. Going back far prior to Christianity, that space has been a place of religious ceremony prior to even Christianity. And so I don't know if you've ever been there for a Vespers or something like that, but I remember when I was there for Vespers one night, I was like, oh, this is one of those thin places. Like I could just feel in my body that it was like something was happening. I felt that in the Western Highlands of, where like Iona is just off of Scotland there. I wasn't on Iona, but I was right by it, and I was like, ooh, this just feels magical. You may have other places, and there's some places that have been identified in different faith traditions as being those places of pilgrimage where it seems like heaven and earth are so close, and people often have visions or mystical experiences, more than one person, like multiples of people will attest, I saw the Virgin Mary here. I saw a vision of Christ here. That's part of the tradition. I have not had that experience, but that's one. Yeah. Well, this is kind of fun. Thanks. Yeah.
So I've been pondering.
It's not on. I broke it. I'm sorry. Oh, try again.
I've been pondering, and in utter amazement, that these women, first off, were educated enough to write their experiences down, and then they were honored enough to have them kept on. They weren't just thrown into the rubbish. And during that time, I understand that they were set apart. They were in convents. They were all with other women. But however, within the convent, there was very little then outside, where people acknowledged, they appreciated the women for what they were doing in their faith and all of that. But were they honored? No, we know that. And so it's such an incredible God thing, I think, that that their writings were kept and copied and published later, and I mean on and on and on and on and on. So that in and of itself just tells me that, okay, this was very special. This was really something important, and just makes me wonder how many more women that were experiencing those things but didn't have the ability to write it down and to because I believe washing the dishes is some of the times that when you're doing that just basic work, and I use work that's when you do have these moments of, oh, holy moments. So, not to say any type of work you can have that holy moment. I'm a huge believer in that, but I just still am just in awe of these women. I knew nothing. Saint Ignatius was kind of the only mystic I really knew because of. No, even before, I've always been an admirer of some of his writings, but I had no idea about these women, and I'm in awe. So just need to share that. Sorry.
Thank you for that. Thanks. And if other things pop up as we go along, we can pause more. What I'm planning to do is I'll move us into then the 4 final chapters, and I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of the mystic that he writes about. So I'm presuming you haven't necessarily read. If you have, this will just be okay, I'm getting everything that I read and having a little bit of refresh around it. So I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of each of them, and then I'll detail how he treats them in the text in terms of what he highlights about their work and why he believes that their work matters. But I'll pause after each one to just hear, was there any of, if you had read this text or if you've read any of the mystics before, where if there's thoughts or things you want to bring to bear, I'll pause before moving on to the next one, okay? Okay, so tonight we are going to cover Catherine of Siena on love of God and neighbor, which he has all these kind of ways of referring to the chapter. So how to give, Hildegard of Bingen on Viriditas, how to be green, Julian of Norwich on weal and woe, how to be blue, Thomas Merton on following a path, how to live and die. I will give a spoiler alert that I asked a leading question last week of our author when I asked him if there was any chapter or anything he would write differently, because I was hoping he would say he wishes that he would have dealt with Julian of Norwich's chapter a little bit differently, in which he takes up depression and uses Julian of Norwich to talk about it. So you will get to hear some of my thoughts about that. That's the only edit that I personally would have loved to hear him say he would have made. But that's where we'll go. And then not really the conclusion, but it's a thing. So the first person, Catherine of Siena, on how to love God and neighbor, which he says how to give. So a little bit about her. She was born Caterina di blah, 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 born the 25th of March in 1347 and died April 29th of 1380, known as Catherine of Siena. She was an Italian mystic and layperson who engaged in papal and Italian politics. And a lot of her work is actually in letter writing and advocacy that she was doing. She was the person responsible for, through her advocacy, getting the Pope to move the Vatican to Rome. She was actually a second woman canonized in 1461. She's revered as a saint and is a doctor of the church, especially due to her extensive writing. From a very early age, she wanted to devote herself to God. And what happened actually was her sister had been married and her sister died, and the parents wanted to marry her off at 13 to the widow. And so she decided to cut her hair, refused to eat, and locked herself in her room because she didn't want that life. And so from a very early age, she had wanted to devote her whole life to God. So she ends up joining a group of women who followed a tradition inside of Catholicism of Dominican spirituality and joined with them. She actually died at a pretty young age. And this is really because she basically would only eat the Eucharist, so she would only eat the consecrated bread, the body of Christ, and because of that, she actually died. She's especially known for the dialogue of divine providence. And she's famous for this notion of her mystical marriage with Jesus. So if you've heard modern evangelical worship songs that are calling God lover, things like that, not only do they have a grounding in Song of Solomon or Song of Songs, but they also have some friends that they might not know about in people like Catherine of Siena. So this notion of the mystical marriage with Jesus, so basically she has a vision in which she marries Jesus, which is depicted in this picture here, and basically is then unified with God. And this is what led her eventually to start eating only the Eucharist. She reported she would get sick if she tried to eat anything else, and the only thing she could eat, the only thing she craved was the body of Christ. In her vision of Jesus, one of the things she recounts is Jesus saying, "Do you know what you are to me and what I am to you, my daughter? I am he who is, and you are she who is not." One of the things that he notes in this book, and that I will also note, is that I think there are parts of our mystical forebears, there are things that you might be like, oh, that is really beautiful. And you might be like, there are things that are pretty alarming, or I think there may have been some other challenges or complications or things that you might say, oh, sweetie, are you okay? Just whatever you're thinking or feeling, though, these are real and important questions as we return to some of these thinkers, but wanting to bring them to bear in the midst of their, complex humanity.
What does that last quote mean?
Okay, so do you know what you are to me and what I am to you, my daughter? I am he who is. So I'll actually come, and you are the one who is not. I'll come back to this actually a little bit in one of the further things, because it's basically a sense of God being the source of all things, and you are not that. But I'll come back to that a little bit more. Because she does further. So this says this a little bit further. In the dialogue, she also describes God as a sea in which we are the fish. So it's this deep sense throughout her work that God is the source of everything for us, and we are not the source or the origin. There is, and it's not shocking given that she literally only eats the Eucharist. There's a deep thread throughout all of her work that's pretty self-flagellating, that's pretty I am nothing, you are everything, you are everything. That's a deep part of her work. Here's just a quote from the dialogue. "Finite language cannot express the emotion of the soul who longs for you infinitely." So here's a little bit of what he does with her work. So he details how in her work, one of the things that actually is kind of surprising about her, because she spends so much of her life sequestered in a cell and in prayer, you'd think, oh, she's just totally removed from the world. For her, after those times of deep contemplation and prayer, she actually moves out into service. And she thinks that that's actually the fundamental call of the love of God, is we are called to be people who serve the neighbor, that's the way that we show and demonstrate our love of God, is through loving neighbor. And so he details some of that and how connected that is. In his summary here, he argues that no mystic has written more profoundly on the theme of love of neighbor than Catherine of Siena. So even as this deep love of God is center for her and the source, writing about the call to love neighbor is present throughout her work. As I named earlier, it's in the time of isolation when she had that mystical union with Christ that she describes in her work, and that centers and is central for her work. So she talks about in her work this cell of self-knowledge, and that's the place. So not only did she physically and literally take space away from people and in prayer and contemplation, she also thought of that as what happens to you in that space of solitude, which is the cell of self-knowledge. It's the place where one grows in knowledge of God and of self because we don't have any place to hide. Which it's true. Like if you've ever watched like the show Alone, which is where people are like in the wilderness by themselves with their own video cameras, highly recommend. That what happens is there's this level of quietude you get to where you can't distract yourself anymore from what's going on within you. And so she names this and the cell of self-knowledge, and this is what then led her to the life of service. So as she's in that space of contemplation and prayer, and as she believes the love of God is the source of everything, she names how, usually in love, like if I love you, usually love is reciprocal, right? I love you, you love me. And she goes like, but we can't do that with God. God loves us with such immense, in her language, immense generosity. And God is the fiery abyss of charity. Like it's this consuming fire that we can't even begin to love back. So the only way we can truly love God back, she argues, is to love the neighbor with such profound charity and excess that we don't expect anything in return. We're always called to serve to the end of ourselves, essentially. And that's the only way we can even begin to hope to show God, to give back our love to God. As you brought up, Jeff, with that quote, the sense of like, I am the one who is and you are not, that's because for her, fundamentally, God is the source of everything, the one who brings us into being, and that's not of ourselves. So that's fundamentally what she's trying to get at. And she says that the soul that God has made, our souls are meant to love. And sin is anything that keeps us from loving. And so for her, it's important to empty oneself of self-love and self-obsession so that we can truly love. So that's where you're nothing, I am the source. And then that way, when we know the love of God, we can live that out. This is his write-up and summary of her. He says, it's not a quote of her work all fully, but it's him saying it. If I dwell within the cell of self-knowledge, keeping before me the truth, that quote, I am the one who is not, and you are the one who is. Then I remain connected to myself's true source. It is when I believe and behave as if I were my own source, when I sin, that I forget that love is the self's very nature, and the demand of my neighbor becomes a threat. So we are called to that remembrance to reconnect with the true source so we can truly love our neighbor. So he argues that Catherine matters now for us because we live in a time where the church isn't always known for loving their neighbor well. And so Catherine reminds us that the fundamental call of the Christian life is to love the neighbor. Also with her work is the challenge to move more into the cell of self-knowledge where we quiet the outside voices, what tells us what success looks like, or those external things, and we move into spaces where we can reconnect with the source, which is God. And that to love the neighbor is the language of prayer. So that's his invitation to us to say, here's some of what I think she can bring. So I want to pause. Any initial thoughts, responses, your own history of interacting with Catherine or Catherine's work, or anything you want to pause on. And Matt, is this one dead? Is that Or was it a user Sarah error? Okay. Hello, hello.
Hello. Do I need to be a Christian or believe in God in order to love my neighbor?
In my opinion, no. If you're asking Catherine, probably yes. But I would say that, sorry, I'm getting like up in your, I would say that one could name as a Christian that the fundamental source, this is literally a question that got asked when I was in I remember my sophomore year of high school in youth group, and someone asked it, my youth pastor said, yes, you cannot love if you are not a Christian. And she never came back. So I think what I would say is that as a Christian, what I name as love, we say God is love and love is God. And I think that that's the core and source. And I think other traditions name it differently. And I think love is whatever your faith or not. And whenever we see love, we get to see whatever one might name as God. And I name as God and as the love I know in Jesus. But I don't think I am God. I do think I can see love in the world, and I trust God will figure that out. So I don't know exactly what Catherine would say to that, but I think basically she would be like, the source is God. If you're not connected, you can't fully know God, but perhaps, I don't know her enough I'm not a Catherine scholar, perhaps she would allow for whenever you see neighbors being loved, you see a representation of the truth of the source. Thanks. Other thoughts or your own history or experiences with Catherine? Your buddy Catherine that you've met before? Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Well, this seems like a really profound train of thought. Why isn't she better known? I mean, she should be taking over the world, or her thoughts should be. They're off in a corner. Anyway.
I feel like our author would be so thrilled to hear you say that. Good old Frederick, whatever his name is. I really appreciate that, and I think you actually, a couple things. One is you do see a deeper influence of these thinkers on different theology, even if it's not footnoted. So that's where I was kind of joking about some modern evangelical songs where you hear this, God is lover, God is these sort of things. But actually, I think you see that even without knowing, these ways of thinking about God actually have permeated, and you see them pop up in different moments, even if they're not as formally known as Catherine's work. Like again, we talked about the image of God as mother, right? That actually, right, it dates back, actually prior to some of the mystics too, but you see it pop up again, and it's, I think, some mystical way that the Spirit works throughout history. But then I think there has been more of a modern movement towards some reclamation. Part of why we're doing this class is to be able to say, who has gone before us? And how do we ground ourselves in some of these forebearers so that our own faith roots can be deepened and we can figure out how to be faithfully Christian in renewed ways through hearing from their wisdom. And so Frederick Bauerschmidt, thanks you for your comment and agrees, and I resonate. And, may this be also a way where if things pop up for you that you might read more, and then you'll tell other people, hey, I was reading. Did you know this quote? So thanks for that. Okay, I'm gonna bring us into our next person, and we'll go from there. So Hildegard of Bingen on Viriditas on how to be green. I will get to what that word means in case, like me, you didn't know. Just on the perchance case that you didn't know.
It's not easy.
It's not easy being green. This is true, right? When I read this chapter, I also thought of that song in my head. So Hildegard was born in 1098 and lived until 1179, and was a German Benedictine abbess. She is known for being fierce as anything. She was a writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, visionary, considered by a number of scholars to be the founder of scientific natural history in Germany. I mean, her influence on just beyond her community and her tradition is very significant. She also wrote theological, botanical, and medicinal work, as well as, in her spare time, letters, hymns, and liturgy, and poems. And also, fun factoid for your family Bible Christian scholar trivia that you will play. There are more surviving chants by Hildegard than any other composer from the Middle Ages. Bet you didn't know that. I didn't. And then on October 7th, 2012, Pope Benedict X named her a doctor of the church. There had been a lot of debate that she actually had been canonized before, but there was no official canonization until 2012. So the focus that he takes in this book is really on her work on the natural world and faith. And so here's a line from the Book of Divine Works. Green finger of God, the vineyard you planted glistens in heaven like a pillar of light. So a little bit of then how he names and details and highlights some of her work. Basically, he spends the first part of this chapter, which I don't know if anyone else who read this, I sometimes found that introductory matter not as helpful. Like it got too long and I was like, are you going to ever talk about the person? And so this one took a while. It took from 96 to 104, where he's basically situating us in our world in which there's climate concerns and climate change and these existential fears that we have about environmental crisis, and the ways in which in view of that, people have turned to different spirituality to try to care for the earth, from deep ecology to this is, I never know how to say this. Do you say Gaia? Jaya, but it's a goddess of the natural world hypothesis. And so he then says we need to, as Christians, need to look to the Christian theology where there is a distinction between God and creation, while also believing that the natural world is part of our journey to our own union with God. Like it's not just something separate that we're meant to dominate. It's something much more about how we experience God, and we have a responsibility to it. And so in that space then, he's like, a better person for us to turn to is Hildegard. So she had many visions, and she was indeed a visionary leader, and her theology really integrated and dealt with the intersections of God, humans, and nature. And for her, this is known in her work in Latin in the Viriditas. So let me say a little bit more about what that means. In Latin, it literally is greenness, and it's a word meaning vitality, fecundity, lushness, vendor, or growth. So basically, it's like life goodness, like the green stuff, things are growing, life is flourishing. That would be my translation. And she used this term throughout her work to refer to or symbolize spiritual and physical health, often as a reflection of the divine word or as an aspect of the divine nature. So like wherever there is flourishing life, there is God. Wherever you see the beauty and wonder, there is God. So these things point us to the truth of who God is and nature, and ourselves flourishing. All of creation flourishing is, this is God's vision and God's desire, and also how we see God. And it's fun how throughout her work, like in her prayers even, this green finger of God shows up. And that's the sign of God in the world. And this fundamental, where you point to, and there is life, there is life. It's the sense that it's God's love underneath it all that energizes and brings life into being. And so whenever we see the creation, whenever we see the goodness and flourishing, it reminds us that, there is love. There is God's love. So unlike even many theologians up until today, she doesn't see nature as an enemy of the human, but sees humanity and nature being woven together, and that our lives we're part of God's larger creation. And this giant wheel of creation and being is all about God's love. And when we live out the fullness of who we're called to be, think of chariots of fire kind of thing, da, 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 da. Whenever you see a person fully alive or creation flourishing or the wonder of the mountains, this is them embodying their destiny to give glory to God, who is the source. Again, God is source, shows up in her work. And so guided by this, all of creation, thinking of the passage from Romans 8, is groaning as if in labor. And so it's our job then as Christians to be a part of the greening power of God that guides us to help creation and ourselves to be free so that everything can burst forth in the way that God desires. So we're supposed to be part of midwifing, bringing into being that fullness of God's green finger in the world. And part of that then becomes a challenge to us to refuse consumption that is harmful, to have a level of moderation. So she's writing this not recently, right? This is long ago. She's like, we need to be mindful about consumption. And I'm like, what did you do? You cut trees for your spoons or something. And so what a powerful then witness to modern life too. So here's just a quote from her. There is nothing in creation that does not have some radiance, either greenness or seeds or flowers or beauty. Otherwise, it would not be part of creation. And I love this image too, because she's also represented as a woman of color there. Oh, and I liked this image too, because guess what? People also age. In case you didn't know. You can see a lot of these pictures of saints or writers, and it's like them when they were 32. And so it's always lovely, I think, when you're like, hey, they lived and they continued to grow in wisdom. So why Hildegard matters now. This is how he ends the chapter. He names how she both helps us to recognize everything, all of our work. We are gardeners, right? We're gardeners tasked with responsibility, but it's not the final thing. It's provisional in nature. And yet it is our work to tend to this garden that God has given us and to preserve it. And fundamentally, she is a saint of old who can speak to creation mattering for the life of faith. And it matters in and of itself, but as people of faith, us honoring creation matters. And cultivating creation is important, and also always new creation awaits. So that's what he shares. So I'll pause there. Any thoughts or your own historic readings of Julian or... Yeah, Linda.
I was just going to say, we have a place up a mile south of Canada, and it's 5 acres of woods, but over the years that we've had it, I've learned the names of all the trees, all the flowers, all the birds, all the skinks and turtles and fish in the lake, et cetera, et cetera. So it's so much easier to see this whole perspective when you are in a wilderness. When you're here, everything was created by man, and so we are very much into the materialism, but also thinking that we are so great, because look at this housing development. But when you get up there, actually, you just start praying over these animals and plants and want everyone to survive. So kids come to me with, look, we lost this little bumblebee. And I'm like, oh, this is really sad. So
I think you have a sister in Hildegard. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's really beautiful. Yeah. Any other? I just love that she lived so long. You love that, right? That she lived long. Yes. 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 Because many of them did die young. Yeah, it is. It's a really beautiful testimony. She lived long, and because sometimes we can also romanticize, like, you have these folks who end up, they're only eating the Eucharist and they die at 33, right? And she actually was a powerful leader throughout her very long life, and she was prolific in her writings, etc. So yeah, thanks, and that's why I wanted to make sure to have a picture of older Hildegard. And also, oh yeah. Okay, great. And also what's fun is, so my dissertation advisor's actual given name is Hildegard. She's German, and she goes by Hilla. So it was really fun for me to get to reread this, because Hilla is a theologian and ethicist, and part of her work she works as an ethicist and was on the European Commission, and environmental ethics has been a part of her work. And so I think you didn't escape your name.
I was just wondering if there's any note in the book, or if you know of any, where modern environmental work is influenced directly by her, or other mystics that are influencing things. I know that you talked about kind of songs or whatever, but.
That's a really great question, and it was interesting because as I was reading this section, I was thinking about, have I not been paying enough attention to the modern Christian and kind of folks who are doing work on the environment and Christian ethics? So like Larry Rasmussen, I have a friend who's at St. Olaf, who she does environmental ethics, and then there's a guy who we read, and I'm like, I need to go back and actually check the footnotes, because I may have just missed it, but that's a question I want to ask some of them, is so hey, has she figured in your work at all? And if not, could she? Could you write a little bit more on that? Because I think I got into caring about the environment not through Christian theology or any books I read from Christian theology, but from reading actually folks who weren't Christian and doing work to integrate my faith with it. So it took me some time, whereas I'm like, I had a friend, who could have taught me way back in the day. So I think, I don't know enough to know if there's folks, but if you want to do research about that and let us know, I will also support you. Okay, yes.
Out of all the mystics, I did the most underlining in this chapter, but I just want to read one thing, if people haven't read it, but the word entitlement comes up, and that is what struck me, where she talks about asceticism, the austere practice of not indulging our capacity for sensual delight. One of the most important things that she might teach us about our relationship to our environment is the importance of recovering asceticism. She writes about, she may sound extreme, but are our pleasures really so innocent? Do I dare eat a banana, water my garden, drive my car, have another child? The practice of asceticism does not mean instantly answering no to these questions. It does mean that we give up our sense of entitlement to these things so that we can begin to consider saying no, at least on occasion. It's a matter of freeing ourselves from all the things that we consider necessities in order that we may know where to draw the line. And then she goes on. But I thought that was very well put.
Thank you. And the way that he brings that to bear to say, because sometimes I think the mystics can get a bad rap for this sort of this is just all self-hatred and self-denial, and how he beautifully names what she offers in that. So thanks for highlighting that. Yeah, thanks. Oh, wait. Oh, did I get to Julian? Oh, that's Julian. Okay, so we're moving on to Julian. Okay, Julian of Norwich. So on Weal and Woe, How to Be Blue is what he entitles this chapter. Julian of Norwich lived from about 1343 until sometime after 1416. so also lived for quite a while, and was an English anchoress of the Middle Ages. Her writings, now known as the Revelations of Divine Love, are the earliest surviving English language works by a woman. So, yes, of any work. Yep. And this is also where, the monastic traditions were really important for the Western education, for texts. All that got copied within these monastic walls, and so also so much of the reading and writing. But this is the oldest text we have written by a woman. And that's where women also they would get educated if there weren't general schools that women got to go to read and write. But if they were in one of these orders, and some of them would have access to learn and be able to read and write. So she is an important Christian mystic and theologian. She lived in an English city of Norwich, which was an important center for commerce. And I think a couple things, I included this in the note because all of these folks are writing in historic and sociological moments. And so she's also writing she was living in a city that suffered from the devastating effects of the Black Death of 1348 to 1350 and the Peasants' Revolt and the suppression of the Lollards. So these sorts of things, you think about how our contexts shape and form how we experience our faith, ourselves, the world. And so just wanted to highlight that. In 1373, at the age of 30, she thought she was going to die. And that's where she had a series of 16 visions of the Passion of Christ. And she ended up living in permanent seclusion in her cell. So interestingly, kind of back to what you were naming, her writings emerged from obscurity in 1901 when a manuscript in the British Museum was transcribed and published with notes by Grace Warwick. So she wasn't well known until the early 20th century when she became well known after. So some of you know Janet Hagberg. She was a longtime member of this church, and I would say is a modern mystic. But she, when I was first here on staff in 2018, and my brother got really ill that summer, she actually reminded me of this Julian of Norwich quote. She would just randomly, she had this kind of vision or dream or sense that that life was a carousel and God was the center that held the carousel. And so no matter the ups and downs, like the center always holds. And so she had shared that with me. And then she would always text me, "All will be well, carousel." And it was actually a reference to this. And so literally, when I was laboring Josie, she gave me a gift I had given her to have on, which was a carousel pendant. And so while I was laboring, I was rubbing the pendant and remembering these words, which is really cool. So it's a beautiful quote from her: "All shall be well, and all shall be well." And then it actually says, "And all manner of things shall be well." I love the second clause then. For there is a force of love moving through the universe that holds us fast and will never let us go. So all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Why? For there is a force of love, and it will never let us go. So that. She lived during the Black Death? Yeah. So I would say more so with she was a kid and then saw the devastation that caused and still said that, yeah. So if you know nothing else about Julian, I think that's a great thing to just keep is that quote. But a few more things that he makes the connection here, why he names it as about the being blue. Is because she has a deep thread in her work where there's no real escape from either the self or from being in a space of a self who is constantly, as people, we know beauty and pain, and we can never escape one or the other. And that's just pervasive throughout her work, is that sense of how those things are all part of the human experience. I wanted to name, from my perspective, that how he translates some of her work in pages 118 to 121, I find overly simplistic and problematic in speaking about depression. So I just want to say that, so if you read it, just go tenderly or kind of gently in that section, because I think what he's trying to say or get at is the way that sometimes we can become so self-consumed that we can lose kind of the thread of joy or hope, or it's like I can become so, everything's terrible in my own little universe, and I don't take the step out to see there is beauty also all around me. I think that's what he's naming, but that is not the same thing as clinical depression, and I think that's important to say that. Okay. So that's part of what he's talking about, but this thread of woe and weal, so it's basically suffering and joy is what she's writing about, is something that she's aware is constantly present for us in our lives. So she had these 16 visions when she was on her deathbed, and she was overwhelmed by these alternating feelings of well-being and despair. And then through that, she ends up coming to this place of deeper peace, where she was filled with what she names as an everlasting sureness, that like it was always would be well. And she names, though, a lot in her work about this pain of feeling burdened by life, of the woe is always part of life. And she names that throughout her work. But she also names that she's aware we can't get rid of it. Like if we were to get rid of the grief, the challenge, the pain of life, or the joy, we get rid of life itself. And so sometimes she says, those moments when you can't feel God, when we feel that we're left to our own self, that's actually good for our souls to have to be confronted by the woe, especially, and that God doesn't always just rescue us to live in joy. So she, in her work, also writes that our deepest spiritual affliction is our unwillingness to believe in the goodness of God. We doubt that God is infinitely loving, and we think we're beyond love. But she writes, no, that's not the thing with God. We're never, like who we are, our issues, our stuff is never an issue for God. And God holds us, whether we're doing well and flourishing or feeling joy, or whether we are suffering and in pain, God's love always holds us. For her, and this is again a thread you hear from a lot of the mystics, is a sense of that God is our source. And all things lead to God. God's love is endless. She writes about that. And part of our experience in the world is that everything is actually connected to this love. So then she takes us from thinking about the love of God and says that our call is then to be people of compassion, who we can't, again, fully love God or fully know the love of God, but we can join the work of Jesus and Jesus' suffering by suffering with others, being with others in their suffering, and in that way we embody the love of Christ to others by being present with people in their woe, in their suffering, where they're experiencing the absence of God. We come to embody and represent the presence of God that is with them by suffering with them. And then this is also, again, it turns us from being inward focused to actually then moving toward the neighbor and caring for and being for them. I mentioned this earlier, that one of the things with visions that we have, she says we should always test these visions against the call to love neighbor and love God. So if you missed it, the big one that I said is if your vision says that you're going to go harm all of your neighbors, that's not from God. So those sorts of things. So all of the visions we have of Christ or anything, we can test it by that criterion of love. So he argues that she matters now because she invites us to move more into compassion, to experience God's suffering with us through Christ in the midst of the suffering we know in the world, right? All this sociological data, we know what's happening in her life. Like, there's horrible things that are happening all around her. And so she sees Christ as moving into the places of suffering through his own suffering to remind us that we are not alone in the woe, and God is with and for us in that. And then we are called to be those people. And so we can be that now in our world. Where is there suffering? How can we show up to embody the presence of Christ? He also writes about how her work can invite us to move more deeply into the heart of love, which is the heart of God. And also, I think, can help us to be people who can hold the both and tension of that, this is life, beautiful and terrible things will happen. And at the center is the God who holds us in all love. And so all shall indeed be well. Thoughts, questions, observations, your own history of Julian. Of Julian. Is that the? Okay. Okay. I'm going to do then like a 2-minute flyby of Merton, which I feel like Frederick Bauerschmidt would be very sad about. So my apologies to the author, and if anyone is a humongous Merton fan, I also apologize to you. But I want you to get done in a reasonable time. So speaking of more modern mystics, Thomas Merton would be an example of that. He lived from January of 1915 until December of 1968. And he was an American Trappist monk, writer, theologian, mystic, poet, social activist, and scholar of comparative religion. He wrote more than 50 books over 27 years, and his work really is rooted in spirituality and social justice issues, and also has a lot of essays, etc. He was a big proponent of interfaith dialogue and understanding, and the connections between our faiths of the mystical experience. And he actually had relationships with many famous persons from other faith traditions, including the Dalai Lama and others. And so I'm gonna come back to that because we're gonna finish with that because that's beautiful. Oh, that's weird. I don't know what happened. So basically, I'm just going to thread this for him in the work and what Frederick Bauerschmidt writes about. He names our capacity as humans for self-delusion, and how we can have the sense of ourself that isn't fully awakened, and how there is an undoing of the self that can help us to become more honest and more aware of that. And it's essentially like we think that we have everything mastered. We're all good. But actually this violence and selfishness keeps us bound instead of being free. And that part of the faith journey, the call of faith, is to accept that we are lost. To accept that we are in need of God to be present with us in the midst of we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what we're supposed to do. So God, will you be with us? And that sense of God being with us and for us is like just permeates throughout his work. I'm going to then end with why he thinks he matters now, and I'll go then to his prayer, one of his most well-known prayers, which I think embodies so much of his work.
Is that a typo there, Menson?
That would be a type. Yes. It's a new one. We have a new mystic that I'd like to introduce to you. Thank you. No, not at all. So how can we walk when it is too hard to see? So he's basically like, listen, in modern life, who hasn't had experiences of not knowing how you can't see, you don't know where you're going. And so how do we continue? And he thinks Merton can be a guide and a fellow sojourner with us in that. And can remind us that no matter what, our journey points toward God. And just that invitation throughout Merton's work that we need to return to the heart of the matter and learn how to truly see so that we can actually live. So here then, and I'll end with this and then pause if there's any final just thoughts or reflections, but I'll end with this prayer from him. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think that I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does, in fact, please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost in the shadow of death? I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Amen. Amen. Thank you. I think, are there any final, I'll just feel free to leave, are there any final reflections or pause that you want to make sure we name? Otherwise, I'm here. But thank you for engaging this text. And thanks for being here, y'all. We're off from adult ed programming for the next 2 weeks. This next week is a lot of schools' spring break. And then the week after that is Holy Week. So Wednesday night, there is a Holy Road experience for families, especially those with littler humans in them on Wednesday night. Then we'll have Maundy Thursday, Good Friday. And we'll be back with a service project in early April. And then we're going to have Faith and Fake News, a 3-week session in April, which should prove to be interesting and engaging. And I think we may also have another sighting from an author in that series as well. So thanks so much.